Hi, everybody. If she can do it, I can do it. Ground rules. I go by Garen. I'm from California. We don't have last names. Keisha mentioned that I am the Baker-Terrett. I hold the Baker-Terrett chair in violence prevention. The Baker of Baker and Terrett is in the room, and I want to extend the acknowledgement that Keisha began. Sue, hold up your hands so everybody can see who you are. So I'm going to embarrass Sue, and when she's tired of it, she's going to tell me to stop. Sue began the program in injury prevention here, without which the Injury Center wouldn't exist, and its offshoot, the Gun Center, wouldn't exist. Keisha kindly read what I've written in a self-inflating kind of way, that I was one of the first researchers to study firearm violence as a public health problem. Sue was the first. There's a paper, Baker, Terrett, Dietz, published in the Journal of Public Health Policy. Sue was the first author. I came here, some of you heard this earlier, to study international health, having come basically from Cambodia to Baltimore, and sat in the back row being a smart punk ER doc, age 30 or 31. And Sue and Steve changed the course of my career, as they are changing the course of the careers indirectly now of some of you in the room. So Sue, again, thank you for all that you set in motion. And you let me get away with the whole thing. Thanks for the surprise. All right, let's get to it. Another ground rule. I'm going to move quickly. The slides are simple. They are designed to bridge the gap between a technical and a lay audience. You won't see confidence intervals. You won't see p-values. You want that stuff, you can read the papers. I will say that everything that I'm going to talk about today is in the public domain, either published as a journal article or as a preprint on Social Archive. And I'll make a list of everything that we've done and the op-eds that go with it available. Let's get to it. I'm going to pose that question, and we're going to implicitly consider it over the course of our time together. The best articulation of the idea that violence was a public health problem came from Dr. David Satcher, who told the New York Times in the early 1990s, if violence isn't a public health problem, why are all these people dying from it? Direct quote. A few of us in the room remember firsthand, and I'm sure you've all heard the fireside story, about how it was at one time a hard sell that firearm violence was a public health problem. That, I think, has been resolved. But with real relish, at 40 years later, I'm encountering skepticism about the possibility that political violence is a public health problem. Public health journals have bench rejected submissions as out of scope. This is not a public health problem. A reviewer for one manuscript basically said, it's not a public health problem because where's the body count? Fair enough. Have we not heard of primary prevention? From outside public health, I've received reviews and face-to-face comments. You guys have no business studying this. You're a doctor. This is a crime problem. And oh, by the way, you people use weird terms like, what's an exposure anyway? And I react kind of the same way you do. But I think there are some obvious direct effects of political violence. Kills and injures people, maybe a whole lot in our very near future. Time will tell. Josh already outlined a number of potential indirect effects on policy making. Imagine if I can step away from the data for a second. Imagine if in this election cycle, political violence determines an outcome and we have a president in the next term who is hostile not just to public health, but to health in general, to science in general. I would count that as indirect effects of political violence. But finally, and here's where we're going to rest, I submit to you, we expose political violence as a public health problem, that proposition, to the duck test. Does it look like a duck? Does it quack like a duck? If it makes sense to approach it as we're about to, then it's a public health problem. I'm a pragmatist. Little bit of origin story. We follow, among other things, trends in firearm purchasing fairly closely. And this is a display of National Instant Criminal Background Check System checks for firearms going back to 2014. The red line shows you what has happened. The blue line on the right shows you what would have happened if the trend for the preceding actually 10 years, not just the years on the slide, had been continued without interruption. We started looking very closely because in late 2019, we knew COVID was coming, and then it came. First case in the United States was at my hospital, lucky us. But we anticipated, we actually got funding to study the anticipated surge in firearm purchasing that would accompany the pandemic. That surge occurred, not to our surprise. We were able to link at the state level the size of the surge in purchasing to the size of the increase in violence that followed later in 2020. That signal got lost later, but that's a separate story. But then we got on with our business. I got on to taking care of patients with COVID. But then in early 2021, things happened as you see on the slide. It didn't revert to normal as the pandemic sort of became our new normal. And I found myself in mid-2021 going, what in the world is that you're seeing in 2021? And I went down a rabbit hole. We're going to show you the rabbit hole in just a second, but let me just finish with this slide. We follow this like a hawk. We've got last month's data up there, and what we are not seeing is an anticipatory increase in purchasing that might suggest to me that people are arming up now. That's good news. Take the win. All right, but let's go back to the rabbit hole. I took a week away from work. I went to the beach. It's what I need to do when I need to get my head clear. I'm a Southern California guy. And I discovered the literature which was coming entirely from from poli-sci on political violence. And I'm not going to summarize that research except to quote someone who is now a colleague, American University's Cynthia Miller-Idris, who said in an interview with the New York Times, in the middle of 2021, so we've all lived through it, think about the middle of 2021, she said, a lot of people want to see January 6th as the end of something. I think we have to consider the possibility that this was the beginning of something. Click. I came back from that beach week convinced we needed to do a survey. It's turned into a 3-wave survey. We're now planning wave 4, and let me tell you what we're finding. So I'm going to be brief and summative here. The details are in the papers. We are conducting an annual nationally representative longitudinal survey that since mid-2022 has been in the field late May and early June. So I'll show you some of our preliminary results from wave 3. We use an address-based probability sample. It's the Ipsos Knowledge Panel. If you have questions, I'll answer them in more detail. It's a big sample. I'll show you that in just a moment. We've oversampled to get sufficient power for firearm owners, combat vets, because that's an interesting group when you read about political violence, transgender people, because there weren't enough in the panel, excuse me, Californians, because this is in part a state of California funded study. We defined some key terms. We do not use the term political violence in our questionnaire. We talk about force or violence, and force or violence is defined in the questionnaire as physical force strong enough that it might cause pain or injury to a person. So not threats, not shouting and jumping up and down. And then we take that and use the phrase force or violence to advance a political objective that you support for political violence. That's still pretty general, but the questionnaire itself gets quite specific about those objectives. The results, all of them are weighted, as you can see, and the principal weighting variables are there. Here's some survey performance data. Our completion rate in 2022, main sample only, not the best, but enough to work with. 2023 and 24, that's main sample and oversamples. That's the assembled cohort, and those are fine. As you can see, it's a big cohort. You can see the demographics. I put 22 in. They're all weighted to the same standard, so they're essentially the same for all 3 years. Not surprisingly, non-respondents as compared with respondents are younger. They're less likely to be white non-Hispanic, lower levels of education and income, less likely to be married, more likely to work. Item non-response was basically not a problem. Okay, let's get into some findings. I'm going to show you mostly 2022 because that's our anchor point, and then I will show you how things have progressed since. We posed a bunch of statements and asked people whether they disagreed, somewhat agreed, strongly agreed, very strongly agreed. We combined those latter two strata, and that's what you're seeing here. So in 2022, 2/3 of the population agreed that there's a serious threat to our democracy. The slides are wordy. Those quotations are exactly the language that the participants saw. 1 in 5 thought that chose authoritarianism over democracy. That's my phrase. I created that. I can experience in the telling of it the chill I felt writing that phrase, thinking, I wonder how this is going to go down. Excuse me. 16% basically endorsed great replacement theory. Basically 1 in 11 endorsed the proposition that society is governed by an elite comprising Satan-worshipping pedophiles who traffic children for sex. That's the core of the QAnon delusion complex. Not quite 1 in 5 thought the election was stolen. 14% predicted civil war. Was surprised by that number too. We'll come back to civil war a bunch. We then asked about justification for political violence. And here you've heard the detailed definitions. I'm going to say political violence, or eventually I'll say PV. These are the proportions thinking it was usually or always justified. So the 3% is, in general, political violence is justified to achieve objectives that you support. But then we gave a list of 17 specific objectives, 2 of which are listed there for you. They don't all appeal primarily to the right. But 1 in 3 endorsed political violence, usually or always justified, for at least one of those 17. And if they endorsed 1, on average, they endorsed 6 out of the 17. It was about 5%-ish, 5 to 7 for all of them, so I'm just giving you a couple of examples. We then, and I need to spend a moment here, asked of those people who considered political violence to be usually or always justified, so of that 1 in 3, we asked some additional questions. How willing would you personally be? And the words you personally were underlined. Not willing, somewhat willing, very willing, completely willing to commit political violence, first, as you see here, of various types. So these are the proportions, again, of the 1/3. Very or completely willing to damage property, threaten or intimidate somebody, injure somebody, kill somebody, to advance a political objective that they support. So down toward the bottom, 1 in 20 of 1 in 3. So we're down to the 1 to 2% range. I understand the hazard of small percentages. With that understanding, I'll still point out at this point, remember, this is a survey of adults in the United States. There are about 260 million of them, so about 2.6 million people per percentage point, if you're going to pretend like you're not a statistician. We asked that same subgroup, how willing would you personally be, words underlined, to commit violence against others because they are, and we have, there were 9 of these, I've listed 5 of them here. Again, about 5% in each case, because they're an election worker, because you don't agree with them politically, things not on the list, because they have religious beliefs that you don't agree with. About 5% of the 1 in 3, very or completely willing to commit violence. And now, zoom out again. We are looking again at the whole population, not the subset. Thinking ahead toward the future, how likely do you think it is? And by the way, this is the whole population, so without regard to firearm ownership or opinions on political violence. How likely do you think it is, not likely, somewhat likely, very likely, extremely likely, to use a firearm, to do the following in a setting where you think political violence is justified? So this is whole population. 7.7% be armed with a gun, 1.1% I will shoot somebody. Okay, general population, point of reference. Now let's look at some subsets. Again, we're still in 2022. First, party identification. Let me read the footnotes at the bottom because they're kind of small. In 2022, we externally defined MAGA Republicans as people who reported to us that they identified as Republicans, voted for Donald Trump, and denied the results of the election. Strong Republican was just self-identification. And you're going to see several slides in this layout, so just let me spend a moment. The left-hand column are some principal measures that we're going to look at over and over again. So willing to justify political violence for at least one objective, I'll be armed and I'll shoot somebody from the slide that you just saw. And for reference, the general population values are the red text on the lower right, and you will see those on every slide. Everybody's with me, right? Okay, good. So with that point of reference, MAGA Republicans substantially more likely to justify political violence, to report that they'll be armed, not particularly more likely, and certainly not statistically significantly more likely to report that they'd be likely, that they would shoot somebody. We also asked about affiliations with extremist groups and movements. Excuse me. We got here by saying, how much do you approve of? And we named these, and you'll see one more slide. So by name. Don't approve, somewhat approve, strongly approve, very strongly approve. And you're seeing here results for those who strongly or very strongly approved of these named groups. And now we're seeing some differences, no? Basically, 3/4 of approvers of these three organizations justify political violence, at least in at least one instance. High proportions of them saying they're going to be armed, and now high proportions of them also predicting that they are going to shoot somebody in order to advance a political objective that they support. And now named social movements, same idea, 70 to now 90% for supporters of the Boogaloo movement. If you don't know what the Boogaloo movement is, Google it, but don't do it just before bedtime. High proportions reporting that they were likely to be armed, and 1/4 of those who support the Boogaloo movement getting close to 20% of those who support the white supremacy movement saying, I'll shoot somebody. And looking at these results from when we first saw them to talking to you about them right now, I remember every once in a while, I have to take a step kind of back and go, they really did answer these questions, you know? Not making this up. Okay, firearm ownership. We asked a lot of questions about firearm ownership. Not surprisingly, I think, owners more likely than non-owners as a group to justify political violence. But that's a difference. We're looking, I'm sorry, I should have said, these are weighted prevalences, if that wasn't obvious. The weighted prevalence difference here is 9%. An adjusted prevalence difference, if we control for demographics, is down around 6%. And compared to some of the other differences we've seen, this strikes me as small to moderate, but wait for the next slide. Not surprisingly, a substantially higher percentage reporting that they'd be armed. One group has access to guns, the other one doesn't. The difference you see at the bottom, even with adjustment, remains statistically significant, but it's really small compared to some of the other things we've seen. But now let's look at some subsets of firearm ownership. Those who reported owning an assault-type rifle, and those who purchased a gun during the pandemic years, 2020 or later, those who carry always or nearly always. And the options there were, how often do you carry a loaded handgun outside the home? Do not count on your person outside the home. Don't count travel to and from, you know, the usual stuff, military service. And what we're seeing here is very high proportions of people in these subsets reporting justification for political violence, being armed in a situation where they consider violence justified, and particularly for those who carry all the time, an expectation that they will shoot someone, which I take away, and when I'm talking to a lay audience, and I go back to that 1%, 2.5 million per percentage point, that does not apply here because it's a subset, but it's a safe extrapolation from these data to say that on any given day, there are thousands of people abroad in the United States who consider political violence justified, who are willing to shoot somebody, and who are armed, and they're where you are. Speaking of the indirect effects of political violence. All right, now, we're going to move to 2023, wave 2. This is the most complicated slide in the presentation. One of the things that rabbit hole reading had made clear, and some of the results that I haven't shown you from 2022 made clear, is that there was a good possibility that the drivers of support for political violence included some very deeply held, resistant to change, belief systems, which are listed here, and we decided to get data on them. So I don't think anybody else has done this before. If they have, I haven't found it. We used validated scales, portions of validated scales, because we couldn't fit them all in. But in addition to re-asking all our questions about political violence, we asked people items from validated scales on all the forms of what we call collectively fear and loathing that you see on the left. The prevalences that you see on the left are the prevalences of strong agreement on balance with the items in that scale. We had a fairly complex algorithm for allocating individuals from non-agreement to strong agreement. Details are in the methods sections, but if you'll take it on faith, these are prevalences of strong agreement. Many of which were much higher than we expected. Homonegativity in particular, racism hit my worst case prediction. The others at about worst case prediction. I should remind you, this is June and July of 2023. This is before October 7th. I suspect that some of these numbers have changed substantially since, but we don't know. Now, over on the right is where it gets complicated. The big matrix. I don't intend for you to see the numbers. I want you to see the pattern in the colors. The big matrix is of adjusted prevalence differences, row by row, going down from top to bottom, a whole bunch of those beliefs about need for violence, the sort of middle pair, the items we asked about, do you support violence, how many specific objectives do you support violence for, do you support it at all, what's your willingness to commit political violence, and oh, by the way, tell us about your expected gun use. The row at the top preserves the ranking on the left. Okay? So the row at the top has from most prevalent to least prevalent among these 7 forms of fear and loathing. But see the inversion of the color array. The qualitative statement that I take away from this is the largest, in terms of effect size, the largest adjusted prevalence differences are associated with strong agreement with those forms of fear and loathing that have the lowest population prevalences. I've not seen this finding before. Our interim explanation for this is, well, strongly endorsing something that has a very low prevalence is probably a more extreme position than is strongly endorsing something that has a high population prevalence. And one thing, as Josh alluded to, that is very tightly associated with willingness to commit violence is extremism. So, but that's a hypothesis that we're hoping to explore. All right, let me move forward. Change in momentum here. As we went from wave 1 to wave 2 to wave 3, from 2022 to 2023, support for political violence dropped from that 32.8% to about 25%. Expectation of civil war declined from 14% to 5%. 2022 was an election year, 2023 was not. I went around saying, I will bet my next month's paycheck, fortunately nobody called me on it, that we will see an increase this year, an election year. Nope. Those percentages apply to both 2023 and 2024. That is really good news. We are all reading scary numerator stuff about what might happen, but there simply is not, at least in our survey, an increase in the prevalence of support for political violence or for personal participation. More good news. In 2024, given our findings on civil war, we decided to greatly expand that set of questions. And we asked about what form you thought it might take, and we asked, I'm not going to report and talk to you about it, but we asked people, what do you think you might do if civil war broke out? And we did use the term civil war because there's a common generic understanding. 10% of the population would leave the country. I don't believe that, but that's what they said. But we were most interested in the people who said that it was very or extremely likely, excuse me, that if civil war broke out, they would, to use the exact phrasing, participate as a combatant. So pick up a weapon, basically. So good news number one, that was pretty rare. It was about 4%. That was kind of about where I thought it was going to be. But the complete surprise was this. We asked people who, the response options for that item were from not likely to somewhat likely to very likely, extremely likely. We combined those two. So the 4% is it's very likely or extremely likely that I will participate as a combatant. So at the two extremes, the not likely and the very, very extremely likely, we had another question array. Question array. And we said, how likely is it? How likely do you think it is that you would change your position from not likely to very extremely likely, or vice versa, automated questionnaire, that you would change your position from one pole to the other if you were urged to do so by your family members, by your friends, by religious leaders you respect, by public officials you respect, by the media. And the roughly 90% of the population that said, it is not likely that I will be a combatant, were rock solid. Nothing changed their minds. But the people who said it was very likely, of those people, 44.5% said, I would change my position to not likely if I were urged to do so by members of my family. 30% said they would do that if they were urged to do so by religious leaders that they respected. 20 to 30% for the other sources, friends, public officials, the media. I mean, there's a role for the media to play here. So we're coming away from these data going, can we think of a clearer example of research evidence pointing toward a potential intervention? So I'm going to start summing up here. Here's what we are finding. Most of the population rejects political violence completely. Not just once, but over and over again. Across the three waves, the list of, well, what about for this and for this and for this, grew from 17 to 21. So, no, I could see them getting angry taking the question. Nope, not this one either, etc. Completely, no. Most of the endorsers, those who thought it was acceptable in principle, were not willing to get involved in it themselves. And most of those who say they are willing, at least in that specific situation, say we can talk them out of it. We can work with that. And finally, as I've already mentioned, there wasn't any increase in this election year. But there's more to the story, obviously. There are some subgroups that are very concerning. I was telling some of the people I met with earlier today, the next phase of our work is going to involve some predictive modeling. We're going to try and get much more refined in our understandings of who's at highest and low risk. So subgroups are concerning. All of those people who say, but I wouldn't want to do it myself, still create a climate of tolerance that might make it easier for those who don't have such scruples to proceed ahead. I've already mentioned small percentages of a big number is a big number. And something I haven't mentioned before, and we did not explore this because others have, it's very clear that if you ask people, what do you think about political violence? Actually, that may be more specific because the research is done in a partisan context. What do you think about doing violence to members of the other party? And people say, oh, very bad idea. But if you then say, but what if they do it to you first? Retaliatory violence gets a much greater level of support than does primary violence. So we have to worry about that. So this potentially leads us to some interventions and so on. So I'm going to let you to decide for yourselves. I'm convinced that political violence, like other forms of violence, is a health problem, if only because I think it really does pass the duck test. But here's that other piece of the duck test, I think. If political violence is a health problem, then the decision to engage in political violence, like the decision to engage in other forms of violence, is a health behavior. We know a lot about how to change health behavior. There are probably at least a dozen people in this room who know a lot more about it than I do. I do it at the individual level in the emergency department. But what do we know? What are the sources? Family members, friends, precisely the sources that our respondents are telling us, yep, these are the sources who can talk me out of it. So this leads at least to the proposition that we have a potential intervention staring us in the face here. And I don't talk about this, I do talk about peer-reviewed journals, but this has been now for me personally public communication. I write op-eds about this, that people need to start right away. I've been doing it for a few months. Now right away is almost useless. But we need to start having those conversations that, as many other people have said, but now there's some good evidence, political leaders need to tune down the rhetoric. You get the idea where I'm going. But given the evidence, with the additional incentive, it might well make a difference. We're not just hoping it might. We've got the people who are the intended targets of such an intervention saying, that really might work for me. Who knows? But there are other things that we need to do. Layers of protection, right? Public health strategy. This might work for the people who are at lowest risk. It's not going to work for the people who are deeply motivated by some of those forms of fear and loathing that we talked about, or by other things. So all of us, in addition to having those conversations and being out loud in our social networks that violence is not acceptable, need to be attuned. Any one of us could be, it's happened to me more than once, any one of us could overhear that snippet of conversation that says something's going down. We can't sit on that information. We have to be willing to pick up the phone. We have to be willing to call law enforcement or whomever, as, oh, by the way, many people did before the Parkland mass shooting to extend this line of work. It didn't work because law enforcement didn't pay attention, but we can't blame the reporters, the members of the public who communicated information for that. We have to do it. ERPOs. We had a conversation about this morning. California just changed its ERPO law to create what we in my little group call ERPOs for haters. We now require judges who are hearing petitions or evaluating petitions for extreme risk protection orders to consider any evidence of violent acts or threats of violent acts, present or past, directed against groups or places. Think of the list of groups or places that might follow for that. That's brand new. It hasn't been applied yet, but I learned today from you all that something like, not that statute, but that ERPOs are being used for political violence in Washington and elsewhere, and we'll be talking about that later. But think about the virtues of an ERPO here that are its general virtues applied. Nope, we're not going to chill dissent, but if somebody is making concrete threats that don't yet rise to the level of a crime, we can still do something to reduce the implications of that threat by removing the guns from the equation. And then finally, and alluding to that other research, I think that there will be political violence this election season. I would, again, I'd bet that hypothetical paycheck, just the way I would bet it on there will be another mass shooting. Nobody would, because they're here. So again, health problem, let's think harm reduction. The final challenge for us, and for people like us, is that when political violence occurs, it ends there with that act. We don't retaliate. I'm a Californian. I talk to California audiences a lot. We talk about fire all the time. If we're not talking about the Dodgers, we're talking about fire. And I say our job is to be wet ground. So when that spark of violence drops, that's where it stays. There's no conflagration results. Now, last couple of slides. I'm going to go dark here. Well, wasn't expecting that. Let's see what happens. I'm going to go dark. Thank you, room. Alexa, I appreciate it. In the course of this year's work, as some of the predictions that we were making and others were making started to come true, I started wondering about the possibility of political violence emanating from the state, not directed toward the state. For about a year, one of the candidates has been threatening, and he's now quite open about it, to invoke the Insurrection Act on day one, which would allow him to federalize local law enforcement, to federalize the National Guard, to deploy the armed forces against civilians in the United States to punish enemies and quell dissent. Everybody, I assume, is familiar with that story. there's a wrinkle to it that I uncovered. One of the things that's been going on is people have been wargaming a second Trump administration or a second Harris administration. These are high-level war games where the person who plays Donald Trump is, let's say, a retired head of the Republican National Committee. The person who plays the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is a retired 4-star general. You get the idea of the caliber of the players. And I was hearing a presentation about how these games go down by one of the people who runs them, who had written an op-ed in the Washington Post about the results of some of the war games. And I asked the question in this webinar, in that scenario, does the call-up extend to private individuals, and does the state incite violence? And the answer was yes on both grounds. So the possibility in my own personal worst case scenario is that the members of the militia movement, the members of the Proud Boys, could be back behind federal badges, armed, with instructions directly, not generically from the White House, but from the commander-in-chief to use whatever force is necessary to quell dissent. Missing element of that you need to know is that while the Proud Boys, as a well-known organization, are probably history, there are Proud Boys cells, chapters, whatever you want to call them, reorganizing all around the country. The private militia movement may be larger and stronger than ever. There are law enforcement officials openly recruiting members of private militia organizations to serve as auxiliaries to be on call in case there's trouble. So that's that plus the armed forces and so on is the scenario that now concerns me the most. And as I've presented that possibility to first my own colleagues in my group and then to others, I've gotten these sort of like mass shootings that can't happen here answer. And I'm here as an old guy to tell you that it can because it has. The 3 photos on the left, the 2 on the left and in the center are of, these are all from spring of 1970. So a long time ago and maybe 6 weeks away. Well, a little bit more than that. Of National Guard troops with bayonets fixed. They're not using ARs because this is 1970. Confronting an unarmed group of protesters at a university campus in Ohio, Kent State, and then taking aim, preparing to fire in the lower left, and then the immediate aftermath of that action at Kent State. The 2 photos on the right are from Yale University in the spring of 1970. National Guard, same M3 rifles, bayonets fixed. It's nighttime. There's tear gas in the background. No shots were fired. Nobody was killed. But I was there that night. I was a college freshman. The photograph at the bottom was taken right outside my dormitory. I have a tear gas canister that sits on my bookshelf. And it just was about 3 months ago that I realized, oh my goodness, this is my youth coming back, as things sort of all came true. I was going to bring that tear gas canister to show you all, and then realized, no way am I going to be allowed on a plane with an empty tear gas canister, so it's still sitting on my bookshelf. But so the closet of horribles extends to some really pretty awful stuff. I don't think this is going to happen. I'm an optimistic guy by nature, but more, I look at the data. I look at what the people in general are saying, and I think what they're saying is, yes, some bad things might happen, but is the country going to go up in smoke in the next few months? No. Might there be a less acute process depending on who's getting elected? That's a topic for somebody else. I'm going to stop there so we have time to discuss. That's how to reach me. That's how to reach our program. Thank you, and the floor is yours.